important for us to know who we're actually looking at today before we get to the poetry. So it's helpful to give you a little bit of background. So today we're talking about Allied Anglophone prisoners of war who were held in Europe during the Second World War. So the men we're focusing on today were going to be captured between 1939 and 1945, and they were held in prison camps in Axis territory in Europe. So these are the men we're looking at, and this is the area that we're focusing on. Now, the reason for this is that we're looking at a relatively narrow group of prisoners because of treatment disparities and the fact that the men we will be focusing on today were treated in a specific way that left them slightly more privileged than some other groups of prisoners. This is not to say they had a good time or a good experience of capture, that's very much not the case, but the experience of the men we're looking at was very different to the experience of, say, the Polish or then Yugoslavian troops or the Senegalese Tyria. So this is something that we need to be aware of in the groups that we're looking at. And I've also included this image just because I think it's a very beautiful image that describes that feeling of capture. So we have our prisoner of war, who is the mouse here, surrounded by the barbed wire, which is a key element of capture and something that's very common in depictions of the captured experience. And then we have the Nazi soldier here, who of course has the reflection of the cat. So there is that element of threat. And just underneath we have, I am a prisoner in Nazi land. So, what are we going to look at? We know who, and this is the what. The poems we're going to look at today are specifically poems written by prisoners of war held in prisoner of war camps. Now, they might not be authored by the person who wrote them, so sometimes they would write poems in their logs because it meant a lot to them and resonated, and therefore we'll find that the authors don't always match up with the log that they came from. However, I'm not going to be including poems that were written externally and were just a comfort to the men. So we're specifically looking at prisoner of war poems, not just poems that resonated with prisoners of war. And although poetry was a very helpful tool and there was a lot of use of it, we are going to look at those specific niches just because it's very interesting to me to see what is revealed about the experience. So here we have the contents list from Bill Oliver's wartime log, and we can see down at the bottom here we have a whole section of poetry that goes from page 73 to page 150. So he was one of my most prolific poetry writers. So we know who we're looking at, we know what we're looking at, and of course we need to know why we're looking at this. So I've been studying the experiences of Kriegies, which is a term that could be used to describe these men, which is short for Kriegsgefangene, which is the German for prisoner of war. They would sometimes shorten that to Kriegies as a form of ownership over it and a form of identity that they built for themselves. And when I've been looking at this, something that I think is really important is representing the men in their own words. We have access to wartime log diaries as well as other kinds of diaries, and these can really show us what was going on at the time, what the men were writing, what kind of experiences they were talking about having. And if we have that information there, I think it's really important to look at that, to absorb that, and to reflect it back so that other people can see that experience and learn more about it. And in terms of poetry, as you can see from my chart here, out of 30 logs which I looked at and analysed for my PhD, only one of them didn't have any poetry in it at all. So this was something that did strongly resonate and was very important to people. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean the poems are good. I'm not going to mislead you. If you came today expecting Dulce et Decorum Est, I'm afraid we're going to be closer to boom, boom, boom. But I think there's still a huge amount of meaning in those poems, and hopefully by the end of today, you might agree with me. I also love the quote that poetry is language made special so that it will be remembered. And I think that's a fantastic way to think about the poems themselves. The first thing I'm going to do is let Bill Oliver introduce us. So Bill is the gent whose contents page I shared earlier. Bill was part of the US American Air Force, and he was captured on the 14th of October 1943, and he was held in Stele 17B until his release in May 1945. So he had a chunk of time in the camp. And this is the poem that starts off his poetry section. The poems written within this book may not just be the best, but if you choose to take a look, take the bad ones with the rest. No Keats or Shelleys or Kiplings are listed in the lot, but Creedy's thoughts are here expressed, whether you like it or not. You may think some are dirty because they cuss a little bit, but maybe that's because you can't see a Creedy's form of wit. But to me they bring back memories of the life you spent in camp, the laughs, the jokes, the sunshine, the hunger, the cold, the damp. So go ahead and read them, say what you want to, but you better say they're pretty good, as keep your damn mouth shut. And I think this is a lovely way for him to start that section, because it does tell us pretty much straight away that these poems are a place for the prisoners to express their thoughts, to express their wit, and to express their experiences. So they're nicely contained in these packages. And next up we have our titular poem, which is also a bill. This is called Jerry Soup. So Jerry refers to German. It would have been one of the slang words used. So you had Jerry soldiers, which would be German soldiers, and then you would have like Tommies being used to refer to the British. So Jerry Soup. While bumming around the country, I've had some lousy meals. I've learned how lukewarm coffee tastes. I've learned how toning feels. I've eaten meat so awfully tough it would wear your teeth off short. I've eaten hash that was so rough it would make a bulldog snort. I've eaten biscuits light as lead and pies that taste like glue, and some of the cakes would lay you dead, and I've had some lousy stew. I've had some eggs that were so rotten the smell would make you sick, and bread that tastes like so much cotton, stuff a brave pig wouldn't lick. But of all the bad things I have had, you could bunch them all in one group, and they would not be half as bad as a bowl of Jerry soup. So I'd just like to ask you, this is a very subtle message, but can anyone pick up from this how Bill felt about the soup? Not good. Bill did not like the soup. However, I think if Bill had just written on one of his pages, the soup is bad and I don't like it, I'm not sure that would convey quite the same message as this rhyming verse that he's put some work into. And he's not wrong. The soup was notoriously awful. Now, when we think of soup, we're probably not thinking of extremely watery, greasy meat, possibly bad vegetables, which sometimes came up in the Red Cross reports on welfare of the prisoners. There was a lot wrong with the soup. There was a lot that was not good about it, and I think Bill does a good job there of assessing that fact. Now, Bill's last one was a standalone poem. His is the only diary that I've found that one in. One of the things I do see a lot, though, is poems that riff on existing poems. So I know I said we weren't going to share any that were written outside of the camps, but with If, this is one that kind of riffs on an idea. So as you can see on the side there, we've got with apologies to Kipling, and this is very common. We'll have if in a lot of varieties, and there will be a variety of apologies to Rudyard for these choices. And this wasn't exclusive to prisoners of war either. There's actually one written by a land girl about the experience of being a land girl as well. So the one in Olaf Lambert's wartime log is all about kind of existing in the camp. So if you can ever keep your goods when all about you, or losing theirs and blaming it on you, if you can hook a meal when friends doubt you, yet make allowances for doubting too, if you can wait and not be tired by waiting, when Henry shuts you out without your food, and when tunnelling the men to walk straight in, you take a philosophical mood. So there's a lot of little aspects of camp life tied up in those few lines. It does go on, but I won't read you the whole thing. However, we're really thinking there about the crowding, about the issues with the other men in camp, and how sometimes it might get very irritating to be trapped in a relatively small space with a lot of other people. There's lots of little things as well, so we're escaping, and the Germans have just walked in and caught us. These are all elements that are tied up in the poem. However, with these ones, if you can read the writing on the left, you might notice that they're different. So this one is if you can wait and not get tired of waiting, when someone makes a boo while on parade, or stand out in the cold in your pyjamas while Hauptmann Miller weekly search is made. There's lots of little riffs on the experience of camp life. And this is also true in Escape, which is another version of If, but just titled differently. So here we have one completely focused on the experience of trying to escape. So if you can leave the compound undetected and hide your tracks, nor leave a single trace, then carry out the program you've selected, nor lose your grip of distance, time, or space. So this one is all dedicated to the process of getting out. We then have my very favourite poem, I think, which is one that has a variety of options. So instead of being all riffs on an existing poem, this one tends to be relatively consistent across the camps. And when I say across the camps, I do mean that this poem was shared quite widely. So this is one that I've found in quite a few different logs, and it's titled in a few different ways, but this first iteration is There's Always Bloody Something. And this one's actually really satisfying to read, because you can just feel the dissatisfaction coming through. Bloody times is bloody hard, bloody wife, a bloody guard, bloody dog in a bloody yard, bloody, bloody, bloody. And that rhythm keeps up throughout the whole poem. And then we get to the end, now I've reached the bloody end, nearly round the bloody bend. That's the general bloody trend, bloody, bloody, bloody. We've also got sections where we're talking about here, don't you get your bloody goat? Was it Shaw who bloody wrote? Where the hell's that bloody boat? Bloody, bloody, bloody. So even in this, although it's a fairly simple kind of rhythm and pattern, we have a lot brought into this about things that are going on in the camp. So in the third verse down on the far side there, they're talking about the ice rink and the mud, the fact that skates are no good. This might seem a bit out there for men who are in prison to be doing, but actually they made the most of the freezing temperatures and would make their own ice rinks. So they'd build a low wall and they'd flood the area and then let it freeze, and then they'd be able to skate. However, their bloody ice skates weren't very bloody good. Bloody, bloody, bloody. So with this poem, we learn a lot about the camps, even though it's relatively simple. And as I said, this one travelled. So I do love the iteration here at the bottom as well, with gee, I'm bloody grassed. So you can tell that there's a lot of frustration tied up there. Now we have this next iteration from a different diary. There's only a slight change in this one, which is just that verse 9 and verse 10 are swapped around. So the final one we've got is Where the Hell's the Bloody Boat? And number 9 is Now We're at the Bloody End. And again, another version here, which is again, There's Always Bloody Something. Ooh. Whereas with this one, we change very slightly just in terms of the title. So now we have it as A Prisoner's Lament. So you'll also see this written as A Creagy's Lament, but this will all refer to the same poem. So we do tend to end up with variations on a theme, but with this one, it very much kind of stays the same. We stick with the salmon. However, with the salmon in this one, we have in previous ones, so the salmon is, I think, the 4th verse down. So, yeah, number 4. Bloody salmon's bloody queer, looks at you with bloody leer. Is it good? No bloody fear. Bloody, bloody, bloody. By the time we get to this one, salmon makes me shake at bloody knees. So it's very slightly different, but we've still got the same kind of words, themes and topics pulling through. Now, I also produced a bit of a rough map of this as well, so you can see the different camps that I pulled this from. These are places near the camps, but just to give you a rough idea of how this travelled across Europe. So it's not like these camps were next to each other either. These were poems which were in logs from places that were very spread out. In terms of travelling between camps, there was a few ways that could happen. So men were just transferred. That was a thing that occurred. They wouldn't necessarily always stay in the same place for the entire war. There was also things like newspapers that got circulated. There was some propaganda papers, such as The Camp, which was a German-run newspaper which was circulated to prisoners of war, that men could actually submit things to. And there was a whole variety of different ways in which they might make it round and about. But also it highlights that these were being performed and shared. And I think that's a really important part for us to remember. These poems weren't just being written in a log to express a little bit of dissatisfaction and then never returned to. these were being shared because they were a communal kind of thing. They talked about a communal frustration. And honestly, if you get a group together and read bloody, 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 it's quite fun. I did it for a performance we did a while ago, and everyone loved getting to yell it. It's a fun rhythm. And that's the kind of thing that when you have a lot of time to fill, it's a good thing to be able to perform and share. And it was definitely shared. Now, I would love to ignore this poem and the next one. These are my least favourites, but I also think they are very important to talk about as well. So, with being in a prisoner of war camp, it's very important to consider that these men could have been captured in like 1940, and that was just it. They were stuck then for the rest of the war. They were in the camp, they couldn't visit family, they weren't able to get home at all, obviously, but also they relied on the postal system getting things to where they needed to be. And when you're relying on post in an active war zone, you can't necessarily guarantee that all the letters are going to arrive on time, that they're going to be regular, or that you'll get them at all. It was prioritised by the Red Cross, and there was a strong attempt to make sure that these lines were happening and the men were getting post. But there were some prisoners of war who didn't receive any letters the entire time they were in captivity. Now, this made it very hard to maintain and retain your relationships, but also to retain your identity in relation to those relationships. So, when we think about a prisoner of war, we're not just thinking about a prisoner, we're also thinking about somebody who's in one of the armed forces. So they may be a soldier, they may be in the Air Force, they may be in the Navy. But they're also a son and possibly a brother, possibly a father, possibly a husband. There's all these other layers and elements to their identity which start to be chipped away by their experience in camp. Now, sometimes they worked hard to rectify this, so if you were a Liverpool football fan, you could go and watch Liverpool play in the camps, because they formed Liverpool Football Club so that you could do that. But there were other elements which would be much harder to recreate, and one of these was, of course, relationships with your family and your children. And especially with children, as we know, they grow fast. And if you had a very young child when you were captured, you miss out on a huge chunk of their life and a huge chunk of their development. So there was a lot of concern about their place in these lives, and whether they'd be remembered, whether they'd be thought of, and what was going on at home. One prisoner of war wrote extensively about nightmares he used to have about his daughter just not remembering him because she was newborn when he left. This was something that really, really plagued him. And with these poems, this one and the next one I'll show you, they very much riff on the idea of this child at home who's trying to understand what's happening and is just really struggling to do that. They also write them in what they feel is the style of a child. So we'll have like, "Dear Dad, I'm writing this with my own hand. It makes me kind of sort of shiver, you understand." So they're not good, but these meant so much to the men, and you will see them writing about how impactful and how meaningful these poems were. We get this section here, which is my favourite line. "Oh yes, I meant to ask. Why, Daddy? Why?" So this is the kind of dramatisation we're getting. But you can understand that when you've been away from home, that when you're worrying about your child and your place in their lives, that actually this would be very emotive for you to think about. And in the same vein, we have a child's soliloquy. So this is a poem which was written by Frank Stemming. Now, this is actually in the wartime log of a gent named Clement Brestow. Clement was kept in the Stalag 17B, and Frank Stemming was actually the editor of the paper in Stalag 3B. Yes, he was in Stalag 3B. So these camps were very far apart, so you know that this poem definitely travelled. There's also wartime remembrances and memoir that people have written where they talk about this poem and how they wrote it down every time they heard it performed because it meant so much to them. And with this one, it is a girl writing to her dad. So it's, "You won't be coming back, I guess, to see the pretty yellow dress. You know, I kind of sort of thought you would, because I have been so very good." And it goes on like this. We've got the elements of the mum being really upset. So when you play soldiers, mummy cries and cries. There's a lot of praying for your dad to return. And this is just that kind of element of worrying about what's happening with your family and your identity in your family. Are they missing you? Do they want you back? Is your child having a really difficult time understanding why you're gone? And this all comes across in these poems. Now, similarly, in terms of identity, masculinities in the camp is something I find really interesting. As well as worrying about your place as a father and a husband and things like that, you might also be worrying about your status. Now, being taken prisoner of war was not necessarily considered a neutral thing. And it's hard to actually fully gauge public opinion on this because a lot of people knew prisoners of war and didn't necessarily immediately think that they were having a good time, that they were out of the war, that they were in a holiday camp, that they were safe and secure. But some people very much did think that was the case. And this was also aided by things like the Red Cross magazine for prisoners of war families. It was sent to try and reassure them, but what they ended up doing was kind of sending a lot of pictures of them like gardening or putting on a play, and not really talking about the realities and harsh aspects of camp life. So people did get a little bit of a skewed opinion. One of the things that also comes up a lot is Dear John letters. So people will talk in the logs about these letters. One of the really common things that gets brought up in prisoner logs is a little excerpts from letters page, where they'll write down things that they thought were interesting or funny from other people's letters. One of the really, really common ones that pops up a lot is, Dear John, I've married your father, love Mum. So that's one it's quite humorous, but essentially it's somebody being broken up with. And then you'll get more harsh ones as well that are like, I'm marrying a real man, I'm not going to be with you anymore because you're not off fighting in the war, you're not doing something important, you're not a soldier, you're not fighting, it's over. And although obviously the funny ones get spread around and are obviously more likely to be written down in the logs, there is an element of truth in the amount of Dear Johns that were coming through because some camps actually had to develop systems to deal with that. So similarly to in the forces now, they would post the letter up somewhere public and people would come and critique it. This was a method of kind of trying to soften the blow a little bit. So you'll see they've sometimes stuck in an annotated letter or they've drawn out the letter and put in the annotations. So there'll be things like, oh, this bit's really cliche, or we're not quite getting to the point here, and other kind of little comic biting tidbits to try and help soften the blow a little bit and have that element of community. And when we think about this positioning, I think Draft Dodger is a fantastic example of how the men thought about themselves. So Draft Dodger, which I realise is possibly a little bit hard to read, goes along the lines of, I'm writing this short letter, and every word is true. Don't look away, Draft Dodger, for it's addressed to you. You feel at ease and in no danger, back in your old hometown. You cooked up some pitiful story, so the draft board would turn you down. You never think of the real men who leave home every day. You only think of their girlfriends that you can take away. You sit at home and read the paper, you jump and yell, we'll win! Just where do you get this wee stuff? The war will be won by men. Just what do you think, Draft Dodger, what this free nation would do if the men all were slackers and scared to fight like you? Well, I guess that's all, Mr. Slacker. I suppose your face is red. Britain is no place for your kind, and I mean every word I've said. So, I'm closing this short letter. Just remember what I say, and stay away from my woman, because I'm coming home someday. So, what kind of impression of the positioning of the prisoner do you get from that poem? How are they thinking about themselves?
Heroes.
Exactly. They're very much the real men. They're going away and fighting every day. They're part of the war effort. But these awful men at home aren't. These people in the draft on, who are avoiding the draft on. And I think this is a really interesting thing to look at in tandem with the letters that are coming in, because they're getting letters saying, you're not fighting, you're not a real man, we're breaking up, I want to be with a real man. Yet here, we're getting that positioning where actually, no, the draft dodgers aren't the real men, we're the real men, we're fighting, we're part of the we that's going to win the war, they're not. And I think it's fascinating to look at how they choose to position that, despite what the excerpts from the letters are also saying. And it is true, they are fighting, they're soldiers, they're air force, they're military, they're taking part in the war, and I think that's important and significant. But obviously it goes against some of the letters and perceptions from home. Now, there's quite a few of this one because it was very popular, and this does tend to change a little bit. So, as I read before, we had, so I'm closing this short letter, remember what I say, staying home, stay away from my woman, I'm coming home someday. At the end here, we have stay away from my girlfriend tramp, for I'm coming home someday. We also get things like you lousy RNAT. Most of them will have America is no place for your kind. I've only found one that is Britain is no place for your kind. So that just gets slightly amended based on nationality. But generally, it's the same kind of thing. Now, this version is actually down as advice, but it's the same poem. So I'm writing this short letter and every word is true. So we've still got the same thing here, just with a different title, possibly because it was read out and not given the correct title, or just possibly because they thought they had a better title for it. And I've added another map here. I know it looks like 2 is missing. I promise it's not, it's underneath 4. So they were both from the same camp, but then we have, again, other ones that are moving into different camps. Now, you'll notice there is an element of grouping that's kind of similar to the previous one. This is just partially because of the grouping of the wartime logs that I analysed. Some of those are very large camps, and things like Stalag Luft 3, which was an Air Force camp, are very overrepresented. Ones that were officers' camps, which would be known as O-flags, or Stalag Lufts, had officers who were above the rank of non-commissioned officer or above. This meant that they weren't compelled to work, which did mean that they had more free time, so you will sometimes find a bit more of an abundance of wartime logs from these men. Now, the last one I'm going to talk about today is Kriegsgefangene Kelly. Now, this poem is tied up in liberation, and liberation should seem like a very simple topic when we're talking about prisoners. They should be happy about it, it should be something they're looking forward to. And it was. A lot of logs are very much focused on getting home and how excited they are and how much they want the war to end. But a big part of what they have to consider as well is how they're going to reintegrate. And this is something that does come up in prisoner diaries. Often it's in a very jokey way, as with this poem, and we see other examples of this in things like a picture series, which is called Creepy Returns. And that's kind of showing all these images of things like a man sleeping in a bunk bed with his wife. There's one where the mother-in-law is approaching and he's yelling, "Enemy up!" And he's trying to barter for a fur coat with chocolate bars and cigarettes because that's what he'd do in camp. And on the face of that, it's very funny. They're all humorous. But what they're also talking about is the fact that they have lived a very different life experience for a chunk of time now, and they have to go and reintegrate into life. And some of them are very concerned about how that's going to happen. There's a really poignant image where it's 2 men walking in a camp, and it's just titled, "Do you think they'll notice we've changed?" And I just think it's fascinating that they were worrying about this while also being so excited to go back. So with Kriegsgefangene Kelly, we have another funny way of looking at it. But it's Kelly, get your barracks bag, the shipping list is here, we're sailing on the first tide for home in yesteryear, but Kelly stirred no muscle to join the homing flocks. He was parked beside a tiny stove, beside a Red Cross box. Now, I won't read you the whole thing, but basically he's not going because he's got food left in his Red Cross parcel. Now, food in the camps was a dire situation, as we touched on with Jerry Soup. It wasn't pleasant. Most men will credit the Red Cross with keeping them alive, essentially. They provided Red Cross parcels, which were full of food that helped sustain them, and these became a very important part of that camp experience. So for Kelly here, the thought of leaving that and having to go back is just a very difficult thing that he's not going to do because there's food in there and he is staying. He just can't comprehend the thought of leaving the camp. And then we've got another version of this as well. So repatriation itself was an experience that was overall positive, but there was a lot tied up with that for the men. And there's just a fantastic diary by a guy called Arthur Evans. Now, he wrote this log, I think he wrote his experience in 2013, so that was when that was published, and he was obviously released in 1945. Now, he writes a lot about the process of coming home and how that experience was for him. Things like the fact he could just go for a walk was incredibly freeing for him. The thought that he could just get up and walk and not be told which direction or what to do or anything else. But a quote that I think is very important from him is, "For many years afterwards, I suffered from nightmares. For a long time, I had dreams in which I spoke fluent German, and when I recalled the dreams, I was surprised at the large vocabulary I retained in my mind. Nightmares and dreams in German are now past. Instead, I dream of an environment in which I am not completely free, but under some form of loose and almost inevitable surveillance." So, even though that was written in 2013, even though he was released in 1945, that experience did change and stick with him. So, although we have our jokey kind of poems and the talk about Kriegsgefangen Kelly and not being able to let go of those trappings of camp life, there is an element of truth there that they had foreshadowed. And with that, I'm done. Thank you all very much.